At the Christmas Eve dinner table, I looked at my son and asked, "Did you pay the hospital and schedule the surgery for me?" Yet my son trembled as he replied, "I used that money to invest. I thought this time I would succeed." I was stunned. I realized he had traded my life for an investment ambition he believed was more important than his father's survival. I stood up and walked away. From that very second, everything began to change. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this story. Before we continue, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Also, tell me how would you react in that situation. This is a fictional story dramatized for storytelling, but it carries meaningful and insightful themes. The turkey was perfectly golden, the skin glistening under the crystal chandelier of my son's dining room. But to me it tasted like ash and overdue bills. I sat there, Thane Garrison, 68 years old, and a retired NASA engineer who once calculated orbital mechanics to the 5th decimal point, now trying to calculate the trajectory of my own survival in the sterile silence of my son's affluent world. The dining room in Cherry Creek was a masterclass in modern excess. The walls were adorned with original abstract pieces that cost more than my first home, and the Bannerman cabinets had been replaced with custom walnut that still smelled of high-end wood polish. My son Merritt Garrison, a 40-year-old developer with the same high forehead as his mother, and a nervous twitch in his hands he thought I didn't notice, sat at the head of the table. Beside him stood Leonie Garrison, 36, a lifestyle influencer, whose phone was seemingly grafted to her palm and whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She was currently adjusting the centerpiece, a sprawling arrangement of white lilies and silver-sprayed pine cones that probably required its own permit from the city. I sipped the Cabernet, noting the vintage. It was a 2018 Screaming Eagle. I knew the price per bottle because I'd seen the statement from the joint account I'd stupidly left accessible for what I thought were emergency management purposes. You see, when you've spent 40 years building engines for NASA, you learn that even a microscopic crack in a fuel line can lead to an explosion. My son was starting to look like a faulty fuel line. I hadn't come for the turkey or the wine. I had come because 3 days ago, I'd noticed a series of red flags in my private ledger disbursements that didn't align with the schedule of my upcoming medical requirements. I'd kept my mouth shut, observing the environment, first gathering data like a rover landing on a hostile planet. The renovations, the bespoke suit Merritt was wearing, the new Tesla sitting in the driveway, it was all evidence of a pressure buildup that didn't make structural sense. Merritt reached for the wine decanter, his fingers trembling slightly as he refilled his glass. He was talking about the Highlands Project, a luxury condo development that was supposedly the crown jewel of his firm's portfolio. He used words like synergy and vertical integration, the kind of corporate speak that usually serves as a heat shield for a lack of substance. Leonie interrupted him every few minutes to check her engagement numbers on her latest post, oblivious to the way Merritt's eyes darted toward me every time I cleared my throat. Merritt's wine glass hit the table. Hard. A dark red stain blossomed on the white linen like a fresh wound. He didn't even notice the spill. At first his gaze locked on the silver carving knife as he sliced into the turkey with more aggression than was strictly necessary. I watched the wine spread, a slow-motion fluid dynamics problem, thinking about the blood currently struggling to move through my own narrowing aortic valve. The doctor had been very clear about the window for the surgery, 6 to 8 weeks. After that, the system would simply cease to function. "Merritt," I said, my voice cutting through his monologue about market fluctuations. "You're pouring a bit heavy tonight. Everything okay with the firm?" He looked up, his smile forced and tight. "Just the holiday rush, Dad. High stakes, high rewards. Don't overanalyze the architecture of my glass." I let the comment hang in the air, cold and heavy. Leonie laughed, a brittle sound that reminded me of breaking glass. "Thane, you're always so serious. We're celebrating. Merritt just closed a massive deal. We're finally seeing the payoff from all that hard work." Merritt nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Yeah, Dad. Nothing is too good for family. We're in a new bracket now. I looked at the centerpiece she was so proud of then back at my son. The twitch in his left hand was more pronounced now. He was hiding his phone under his napkin, but I could see the faint glow of notifications. I'd spent my life analyzing telemetry, and the data coming off Merritt Garrison right now was shouting red alert. I set down my fork. The clink of silver against the fine china sounded like a hammer hitting a rail. The warm, festive air in the room didn't just cool. It crystallized into jagged ice, the kind that slices through a man's heart before he even feels the cold. Merritt, I said, keeping my tone as level as a horizon line. Did the hospital send the confirmation for the December 1st payment? The room went still. Even Leonie stopped scrolling her phone, hovering inches from her face. I watched the color drain from Merritt's cheeks, leaving his skin the color of a winter sky just before a storm. The medical fund I set up for you to manage? I continued, my eyes locked on his. The $320,000 I transferred for the aortic stenosis surgery fund. You used it to clear the balance by the deadline, right? Merritt didn't answer immediately. He looked at Leonie, and for the first time that night, she didn't look back at him. Her eyes were fixed on the brand new Rolex on her wrist, her thumb nervously stroking the gold casing. Merritt's mouth opened and closed, a silent engine trying to turn over in a vacuum. He wasn't just nervous. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of nothing but thin air. Merritt's fork slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the plate with a sound like a gunshot, as his eyes darted to the brand new Rolex on Leonie's wrist. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown to an explosion each second, stripping away another layer of the lie my son had built around us. Merritt didn't move. He stared at the silver fork resting on his half-eaten turkey, the metal gleaming with a mocking brightness under the chandelier. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a sudden drop in cabin pressure that made my ears ring. I weighted my pulse, a slow, heavy thrum in my neck, watching the way his jaw worked back and forth. Finally, he looked up, but not at me. He looked at Leonie, seeking a script he hadn't yet memorized. Dad, you have to understand the pressure I was under with the Cherry Creek project. He stammered, his voice thin and reedy. There were market fluctuations, temporary reallocations. I thought I could bridge the gap before the hospital even processed the paperwork. I didn't care about the project merit. I care about the $320,000 I gave you to keep my heart beating. I kept my voice like a scalpel, precise, cold, and cutting through the fat of his excuses. He flinched as if I'd struck him. He began to babble about overhead and high-interest bridge loans, using a flurry of technical real estate jargon to obfuscate the simple fact that he had reached into my chest and pulled out my air supply. How do you calculate the cost of a breath you were promised, only to find out it was traded for a steering wheel and a leather interior? I sat perfectly still, an engineer observing a catastrophic failure in real time. I noticed that Merritt had intentionally diverted the hospital's certified mail to his own office months ago, a detail he let slip while trying to explain why I hadn't seen the late notices. It wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a tactical strike. Leonie, who had been as still as a statue, finally broke her silence. Her voice didn't carry a hint of an apology. Thane, you're looking at this so narrowly, she said, smoothing the silk of her dress. It wasn't just a party at the Broadmoor. It was a brand launch. We needed that visibility for Merritt's firm. It was an investment in networking. We were going to pay every cent back once the Highland property flipped. I looked at the woman my son had married and saw nothing but a polished exterior over a hollow core. She wasn't a daughter-in-law. She was a predator in silk. She spoke about brand visibility, while the man across from her was visible only by the grace of a failing aortic valve. You launched a brand on the remains of my retirement and my health. I replied the words, feeling like stones in my mouth. Did you tell the guests at the Broadmoor that the champagne was aged in the blood of your father-in-law? Leonie's eyes flashed with a brief, ugly spark of resentment before she looked away, her hand instinctively covering her new Rolex, as if the gold casing could hide the theft. She wasn't ashamed of the crime. She was only annoyed by the interruption. Merritt's bravado finally gave way. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. "It's not all gone, Dad," he whispered. "But a lot of it is. The Tesla, the leases, the jewelry, the overhead just ate it up." I asked him the only question that mattered then, if the hospital payment was due. "November 30th, why did you let the date pass in silence? Did you think I'd just disappear?" "Merritt, that the problem would solve itself if I stopped breathing." "No, Dad," he cried out, his eyes wet with desperate, cowardly tears. "I just needed more time. I thought the Highland deal would close by the 15th. I was going to replace it before you noticed." The realization hit me harder than the stenosis ever could. My son was waiting for me to die. He had bet on my expiration date to cover his overhead. He had looked at the man who taught him how to build model rockets and saw only a ticking clock that was taking too long to stop. The betrayal was so absolute, it felt clinical. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, that dull hydraulic squeeze that reminded me my time was a finite resource Merritt had decided to squander. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the wine. I simply stood up, the chair legs scraping against the hardwood with a sound like bone on bone. I reached for my winter coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor. Merritt reached out as if to stop me, but I stepped back, my gaze so cold it seemed to physically push him away. "Dad, please don't leave like this." "It's Christmas Eve." I didn't answer him. My eyes had wandered to his phone, which was sitting face up on the white linen next to the spilled wine. A notification popped up the screen, glowing with a neon persistence. It was from DraftKings. Bet confirmed $5,000 on Denver Broncos spread. The spending wasn't just on Leonie's vanity or Merritt's office space. He was gambling. He was throwing my life into a digital void, one parlay at a time. I looked at the phone screen, the "Bet Confirmed" banner glowing like a neon sign of my execution, and I realized Merritt hadn't just lost my money, he was still playing with it. Pain is an interesting variable. It's never constant, but it's always measurable, even when the person causing it is your own flesh and blood. As I turned my back on the festive glow of Merritt's home and walked into the biting Colorado night, the Bet Confirmed notification on his phone screen stayed burned into my retinas like a solar flare. I climbed into my car, my hands steady only because I forced them to be, and for a moment I didn't turn the key. I just sat there listening to the silence of the suburb and the treacherous rhythmic fluttering in my chest. My mind, trained by decades of aerospace discipline to seek the root cause of every failure, pulled me backward to the afternoon in mid-October, when the hull of my life first started to buckle. It was a Tuesday, the kind of crisp Denver day that usually made me feel sharp, but instead I felt like my chest was being crushed by a hydraulic press. I remember the clinical atmosphere of the University of Colorado Hospital, the way the fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that set my teeth on edge, and the sharp, antiseptic smell that stripped away the illusion of health. I'd walked into the emergency room under my own power, hiding the sweat on my brow and the gray tint of my skin. I even told the nurse it was just indigestion from a late lunch. My brain knew better, but my pride wasn't ready to concede. I sat in that plastic chair, comparing my body to a rocket engine with a failing valve, using technical jargon to distance myself from the primal fear that I was currently undergoing a rapid, unscheduled disassembly. Tick, tick, tick. That was the sound of my heart. Or maybe it was just the clock on the wall telling me I was out of time. I'd actually felt the first flutter of this failure months earlier during the height of the summer, but I'd ignored it. Merritt had been in the middle of closing a critical real estate deal in Cherry Creek, and I didn't want to be the variable that introduced noise into his system. I chose his ambition over my own safety, a choice that I now realized was my first major engineering error. Finally, The heavy oak door of the consultation room opened. Dr. Eris Thorne, the cardiologist whose eyes were as cold as a moon landing and twice as precise, stood over my charts with the posture of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. He didn't offer a handshake or a hollow pleasantry. He just sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked at me with the detached curiosity of an investigator looking at a black box recovered from a wreck. Mr. Garrison, your aortic valve is opening to only 0.6 square centimeters, he said, his voice flat. In my world, that's a critical failure point. Aortic stenosis. It's a fancy way of saying your fuel line is clogged with rust, and the pressure is building toward a catastrophic burst. He explained the mechanics of it. The narrowing of the aperture, the heart muscle thickening as it struggled to push blood through a needle eye, opening the inevitable total system shutdown. He spoke about the golden window, a 6 to 8 week period where the structural integrity of my heart was still high enough to survive a mechanical valve replacement. Beyond that window, the damage would be permanent. How long do I have before the system shuts down, doctor? I asked, my voice sounding distant, as if I were monitoring the conversation from a ground control station miles away. Dr. Thorne didn't blink. We're at T-minus 60 days and counting, Thane. If we don't swap that valve, you won't see the next new year. The doctor then pivoted to the logistics, and that's where the numbers started to get lethal. He outlined the financial requirements with surgical precision: $320,000 total for the surgery, the high-grade mechanical valve, and the intensive post-operative recovery. I processed the math instantly, the figures scrolling behind my eyelids like code. It was nearly my entire liquid savings, the remains of the house sale, and my retirement bonuses. My mind drifted to Sarah, my late wife. We had spent a fortune on her cancer treatments 5 years ago, emptying our joint accounts to buy her 6 more months of breath. I didn't regret a penny of it, but it left this final sum as my only shield against the dark. Is a father's life worth more than a son's ambition? I was about to bet my last $300,000 that the answer was yes. Dr. Thorne watched me, his pen hovering over the chart. 320,000, I repeated. It's a steep price for a few more years of breathing. It's the price of the best mechanics we have. Thane, he countered. Don't wait until the window closes. I looked at the clinical white walls and made a decision that would either be my salvation or my undoing. I decided then and there to keep the diagnosis a secret from Merritt. It wasn't just about protecting him from the fear or the burden of my mortality. I wanted to see if he could handle the weight of the responsibility without being guilt-tripped into it. I wanted to believe that if I handed him the keys to my life, he would guard them with the same integrity I'd used to raise him. I walked out of that hospital with a death sentence in my pocket and a plan in my head, never realizing that the person I was trying to protect was already looking for a way to profit from my silence. I watched the cursor blink on my banking portal, a rhythmic neon heartbeat that felt steadier than the one currently struggling inside my own chest. I'd spent 48 hours scrubbing my life clean of the hospital's residue. Every clinical report, every pamphlet on aortic valve replacement, and even the dry cleaning receipt for the suit I'd worn to Dr. Thorne's office had been shredded and buried at the bottom of the bin. I was engineering a social mission, now one where the margin for error was 0, and the primary objective was to keep my son Merritt from seeing the cracks in my hull. I spent the afternoon obsessing over the details of my apartment, arranging the NASA memorabilia on my shelves, with the same precision I once used to calibrate fuel sensors. I prepared the paperwork for the fund, but I didn't label it with the words surgery or medical. Instead, I typed legacy planning in a bold, sterile font on the folder tab. I told myself I was protecting him. In reality, I was just building a silo for my own fear, hoping that by containing the truth, I could control the outcome. Trust is like a heat shield. You don't realize it's degrading until the friction of reality starts burning through the hull. Merritt arrived at 6, appearing rushed and slightly disheveled. He was checking his phone as he walked through the door, his thumb scrolling with a frantic speed, that didn't match the casual air he was trying to project. He was wearing a brand new, bespoke navy suit that caught the light in a way my old off-the-rack blazers never could. I recognized the cut it was from a tailor in Cherry Creek that charged more for a fitting than I received in a month of pension. It was a strange choice for a man who had complained just last week about a cash flow crunch at his development firm, but I pushed the observation into a corner of my mind. "Dad, sorry I'm late," he said, barely looking up. "Things are moving fast with the new project. We're in the middle of a heavy push." I smiled, hiding the way my breath felt short. "It's all right, Merritt. I appreciate you coming over. I want to simplify some of the family's liquid assets. It's better to have these things in your hands now, rather than dealing with the bureaucracy later." Merritt's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't check it. He just flipped it over on the coffee table, his fingers tapping a frantic, silent code against the glass. He seemed distracted, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for a way out, until I mentioned the dollar amount. $320,000, I said, watching his posture change instantly. Merritt's eyes didn't widen with concern or curiosity. They tightened with a sharp, hungry focus I'd seen in investors just before a shark feed. "Dad, that's a lot of liquidity," he stammered, his voice suddenly losing its reedy edge. "You're sure you don't want to keep it in the Vanguard accounts? My firm could manage that for you, generate some real yield." I shook my head, my hand steady as I opened the laptop. "I want it in a separate high-yield account under your management, Merritt, for specific purposes, safety nets for the family." We sat at the kitchen table together to initiate the wire transfer. I felt a surge of paternal pride as I watched him enter the routing numbers. I believed I was securing my future, handing the baton to the next generation, so I could focus on the fight for my life. When the transfer successful notification appeared on the screen, a weight lifted from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The mission felt secure. I told him the institutional fees would be due by the end of November and instructed him to keep the funds ready for when I gave the word. "I've got it, Dad," he promised, his voice thick with a new kind of energy. "Total control. You won't have to worry about a thing." If I had told him the truth, then that this money was for the very blood in my veins, would he have looked at the screen differently? Would the data have mattered more than the digits I wanted to? Believe the answer was yes. But as he stood up to leave, I felt a familiar, analytical unease. Merritt was already halfway to the door before I could even offer him a cup of coffee. He seemed to be vibrating with an internal pressure, his hand frequently patting his jacket pocket. I walked him to the entryway, trying to ignore the bitter metallic taste of the heart medication I'd swallowed just before he arrived. As he stepped out into the night, the porch light caught something in his side pocket. It wasn't the phone he'd had on the table. It was a second device, smaller and older, and it was vibrating incessantly with notifications. I caught a glimpse of a bright green icon, a sports betting app. Merritt glanced back, saw me looking, and shoved his hand into the pocket to kill the vibration, his face turning into a mask of casual indifference. "See you soon, Dad. Don't overwork that brain of yours." I watched the taillights of his car fade into the Denver night, and for the first time since my diagnosis, the silence in my apartment didn't feel like peace, it felt like a vacuum. The structural integrity of the moment felt off a microscopic misalignment in the landing gear that I was choosing to ignore because I couldn't afford for the mission to fail. In aerospace, silence usually precedes a catastrophic depressurization. In my living room, it just tasted like a slow-acting poison. I sat in the dim glow of my laptop screen 3 days after the transfer, the blue light reflecting off my reading glasses like a pre-flight diagnostic check. My apartment felt larger than it had 48 hours ago, the shadows in the corners stretching as if the walls themselves were withdrawing from the impending failure. I was waiting for a confirmation email from the University of Colorado Hospital's billing department, a digital handshake that would tell me the first phase of my survival was secure. Instead, at 10:14 a.m., a notification pinged that made the blood in my veins feel like liquid nitrogen. It was an automated alert, clinical and cold. The message stated that the required $150,000 initial deposit for my December surgery had not been received by the internal deadline. My engineering mind immediately kicked into high gear, looking for a logical explanation. "It's just a lag in the digital pipes," I muttered to the empty room. 300,000 doesn't move through the ether without tripping a few sensors. I assumed a clerical error or perhaps a standard holding period for large sum transfers between institutions. I was looking for a technical glitch because the alternative, a human failure, was a variable I wasn't ready to solve. Is it possible to hear the sound of your own life support being unplugged? Because that's exactly what a silent phone sounds like when you're 70% occluded. I forwarded the hospital's alert to Merritt with a short professional note asking for the wire confirmation. I didn't want to sound like a nagging father. I wanted to sound like a project manager checking on a milestone. I waited 4 hours. The clock on the wall ticked with a heavy mechanical insolence. I tried to call him at 2 p.m. Merritt's phone rang to the very end before dropping to voicemail. I left a message keeping my voice as level as a horizon line, despite the flutter in my chest that felt like a warning light flashing on a dashboard. Michael Merritt. It's Dad. The hospital sent an automated alert regarding the deposit. Just call me when you've cleared the block on your end. I hung up and stared at the handset. The silence that followed was heavy, a dense vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the apartment. I checked the sent folder. 1 email, 2, 3, all ignored. My son was treating my survival like a spam folder. I tried to distract myself by checking the shared family cloud account, looking for any banking receipts he might have uploaded. I didn't find a receipt. Instead, I found a welcome email from a platinum-tier luxury concierge service addressed to Merritt and dated the day after our transfer. The entry fee alone was 5 figures. My pulse spiked a sharp, erratic rhythm that my narrowing aortic valve struggled to accommodate. By the second day of radio silence, I began to track the lack of communication, like a data point on a graph. I checked Leonie's Instagram. She had posted a story of a high-end furniture showroom in Cherry Creek, tagging Merritt and using hashtags about new beginnings and leveling up. I've calculated trajectories for Mars missions with more certainty than I have about my son's whereabouts in downtown Denver. It was becoming clear that the silence wasn't a glitch in the system. It was strategic. I realized that the man who shared my DNA was treating my impending deadline like a nuisance he could simply swipe away. The trust I had spent 40 years building was currently undergoing a rapid, unscheduled disassembly, and I was the only one left in the debris field. On the third morning, the anxiety became a physical weight I couldn't ignore. I needed to know if Merritt was physically okay or if he was simply hiding. I walked across the hall and asked my neighbor, a retired librarian named Mrs. Gable, if I could use her landline. I told her my cell was acting up. I dialed Merritt's number. It didn't ring to voicemail this time. He answered on the first ring, his voice sounding cheerful, energetic, and completely unbothered. "Hey, this is Merritt. How can I help you?" I felt a cold wave of nausea wash over me. "It's me, Merritt. It's Dad." The line didn't just go silent. It seemed to freeze. I could hear his rhythmic breathing on the other end, a steady, healthy sound that mocked my own labored breath. Then, without a word of explanation or a single hello, the line went dead. He had hung up the moment he realized it was me. I stood there in Mrs. Gable's hallway, the cheap plastic handset still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. It was a flat, continuous sound, the auditory equivalent of a flatline. He knew I was calling about the money. He knew I was calling about my life, and he chose to cut the connection. The line didn't just go dead, it stayed dead, and as I stared at the neighbor's handset, I realized I wasn't waiting for a glitch in the system. I was looking at a deliberate act of sabotage. The corrugated metal door of Unit 402 groaned like a dying beast as I shoved it upward, revealing a darkness that smelled of dust, motor oil, and deep systemic betrayal. I stood at the threshold for a long moment, my flashlight beam cutting through the stagnant air of the industrial storage facility. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a jagged and uneven rhythm that felt like a direct protest against the climb I'd just made to the 4th floor. I hadn't been here in 3 months, not since the day I decided to downsize my life to pay for Sarah's final arrangements. Yet the space felt violated before I even stepped inside. My engineering mind, trained to spot the slightest deviation in a structural pattern, immediately registered a fault. The dust on the concrete floor wasn't a uniform gray blanket anymore. It was scarred by heavy drag marks and the distinct, crisp imprints of rubber-soled shoes. Someone hadn't just visited my past. They had been shopping through it. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline mask the physical ache in my chest as I moved deeper into the unit. Gravity never lies, and neither does a drag mark on a concrete floor. I could see where my heavy NASA service trunks had been shoved aside, their industrial latches left hanging open like broken jaws. My memories were being stripped for parts, like an old shuttle being sold off to the highest bidder at a government surplus auction. I ignored the boxes of old textbooks and blueprints, heading straight for the drafting table in the corner. It was an old, heavy piece of oak where I'd spent thousands of hours calculating heat shield tolerances. I reached for the hidden compartment beneath the primary drawer, my fingers trembling. I found the velvet boxes exactly where I'd left them, but the weight was wrong. I flipped the lids. Empty. Sarah's gold wedding ring, the one she'd worn through 38 years of launches and life, was gone. My 30-year NASA Speedmaster watch, the one I'd planned to hand down to a grandson I'd never have, was gone. Even my Distinguished Service Medal, a piece of metal that represented 40 years of my life's work, had been ripped from its silk lining. How do you value the weight of 30 years of service when your own son sees it as nothing more than 4 ounces of scrap gold? I sank into the dusty drafting stool, the air in my lungs feeling thin and toxic. The violation was so complete it felt physical, like a new incision without the benefit of anesthesia. I stared at the empty silk indentations, my mind tallying the loss, not in dollars, but in the theft of my legacy. She wore that ring through 3 decades of launches, I whispered to the empty room. Now it's just an empty space in a dark room. My flashlight beam wandered, catching on a small white slip of paper tucked into the corner of the drafting table. I picked it up. It was a receipt from a high-end pawn shop in downtown Denver, dated just 4 days ago. The name on the ticket was a lie, but the signature at the bottom, the sharp, erratic scrawl of Merritt Garrison, was unmistakable. He dropped it, a careless debris fragment from a man who thought I was already too far gone to notice a missing orbit. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb hovering over Merritt's contact name. My rage was a cold, hard thing now, a solid fuel booster ready to ignite. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice sounding breezy and detached. "Dad, is everything okay? You're calling a lot today." "Merritt, I'm at the storage unit," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "The ring is gone. The watch is gone. The medal is gone." There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that indicates a system trying to recalculate a failing trajectory. "Dad, you're sounding a bit paranoid," he said, his tone shifting into that condescending clinical softness he used when he wanted to end a conversation. "Are you sure you're taking your pills correctly? The doctor said the stenosis could cause some cognitive fog. I haven't even seen the key to that unit in weeks. You probably just misplaced them while you were moving things around." He didn't just lie. He tried to make me believe my mind was failing before my heart could. Paranoid. I shouted, the effort causing a sharp, stabbing pain behind my sternum. "Merritt, there's a footprint here that matches your size 12 Oxfords perfectly. And I'm currently holding a pawn receipt you dropped on the floor. Don't you dare use my health as a shield for your theft." The line went silent again. I could almost hear the gears turning as he realized he'd left a signature in the dust. "Look, Dad, I have a meeting." he said, his voice now tight and defensive. "We'll talk about this when I get back from the trip. Just stay home and rest. You're clearly stressed." He hung up before I could reply. I stood there in the yellowed, fluorescent light of the hallway, staring at the empty boxes and the pawn slip. He wasn't just stealing to survive. He was stealing to fund a bonus lifestyle he had already bragged about to Leonie's followers, using my expiration date as his credit limit. I looked down at the pawn shop receipt, the ink still fresh, and I realized that while I was counting my remaining days, Merritt was already counting the silver from my pockets. He thought he was playing a game of chicken with a dying man, but he forgot that an engineer knows exactly how to build a trap that only springs when the target thinks they've already won. I didn't go to the police. I went to a specialty shop in a nondescript strip mall because 40 years at NASA taught me that if you want a perfect result, you don't trust the bureaucracy, you trust the hardware. My son thought he was playing with a dying man, but he had forgotten that a man who has calculated the structural integrity of a lunar lander knows how to spot a leak before the oxygen runs out. I had already taken a secondary precaution. 2 weeks ago, during a brief visit to drop off some redirected mail at Merritt's house, I had tucked a small, high-gain listening device disguised as a common USB charger into a socket in his home office. It was a simple insurance policy then, but as I walked into the surveillance shop, it became the first piece of my counteroffensive. The air in the store smelled of ozone and new plastic, a sterile scent that felt more like home to me than the dusty betrayal of the storage unit. A kid with a lip ring and a staff shirt stood behind the counter, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else than selling high-grade surveillance to a senior citizen. I ignored his bored expression and began scanning the glass cases. "I need something with a low thermal signature and a frequency-hopping spread spectrum," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient hum of the shop. "I want pinhole lenses that can operate in low-light environments without an IR glow." The store clerk, whose name tag read Kyle, blinked and leaned forward, his apathy replaced by a flickering confusion. Okay, Pops. We have these doorbell cams that connect to your phone." I cut him off with a sharp look. "I'm not looking to greet my neighbors, Kyle. I'm looking for industrial-grade telemetry. Give me the CMOS sensors with the remote encryption modules." I spent the next hour meticulously selecting the payload. Pinhole cameras, motion-activated sensors, and a miniature router that could tunnel through a VPN. I paid in cash, the crisp bills leaving no digital trail that Merritt could follow. Setting a trap is like calculating a re-entry trajectory. If the angle is too steep, you burn up the evidence. Too shallow, and the truth just skips off the atmosphere and disappears forever. I wasn't just buying gear. I was buying a window into the vacuum where my son's conscience used to be. I drove back to the storage facility, my hands steady on the wheel despite the persistent dull ache behind my sternum. Inside Unit 402, the yellowed fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows across my remaining crates. I didn't just stick the cameras on the wall with tape. I worked with the precision of a veteran engineer integrating the hardware into the existing structures. A lens is just a glass eye. The trick is making it look like part of the socket. I used a cold metallic screwdriver to hollow out the head of a rusted bolt on a shelving unit seating a pinhole camera deep inside. I hid another unit inside a non-functioning smoke detector on the ceiling, ensuring the angles covered every entrance, and specifically the shelf where Merritt had been looting my past. I felt a quiet, vengeful satisfaction with every wire I tucked away and every signal I masked. Do you know what the most dangerous part of a machine is? It's the part you don't think is watching you. Merritt was about to find that out the hard way. By the time I finished and returned to my own apartment, the sun had long since dropped below the Denver skyline. I settled into my chair and opened my laptop, the screen reflecting in my glasses. I performed a final encryption of the signal, a digital handshake, that ensured Merritt couldn't stumble onto the Wi-Fi traffic if he grew suspicious. The screen glowed green. Night vision, The world looked cold, clinical, and completely exposed. I could see the interior of the storage unit in perfect, grainy detail. The empty spaces where my medals and Sarah's ring should have been were now just dark voids waiting to be filled with proof of his greed. Signal clear, I whispered to the empty room. Telemetry established. Now all I have to do is wait for the failure to occur. The high-pitched whine of the frequency-hopping sync was the only sound in my office, a comforting reminder that the hardware was doing its job. I opened the secondary application, the one linked to the bug in Merritt's home office. The audio hissed at first, a rush of white noise that made my heart skip a beat before it settled into a sharp, clear feed. I heard the muffled sound of a door closing and the sharp click of heels on a hardwood floor. Then a voice came through that made my grip tighten on the edge of the desk. It was Leonie, and she didn't sound like the polished influencer she played on camera. "I know the hospital didn't call you Merritt," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the digital static. "I know because I checked your phone while you were in the shower." Merritt's reply was a low, desperate mumble that I couldn't quite make out, but the panic in his tone was unmistakable. Leonie didn't let up. "Don't lie to me about the Highland project. There's a missing bank statement, Merritt. A big one. Where is the money going? Why are you still visiting that storage unit in the middle of the night?" The audio hissed, and Leonie's voice came through the speakers, sharp enough to cut. "I know the hospital didn't call you Merritt. I know because I checked your phone. There is a specific kind of silence that accompanies a total system failure. Not the absence of noise, but the heavy, suffocating weight of knowing exactly when the structure gave way." I sat in my darkened apartment, the only light provided by the eerie green glow of the night vision tablet resting on my lap. The confrontation I had overheard earlier, the sharp sting of Leonie's voice accusing Merritt of lying about the hospital, was still ringing in my ears. I felt like a flight controller watching a black box, recording in real time, helpless to change the flight path, but obligated to document every second of the wreckage. My phone vibrated against my leg at 2:14 a.m. It was the motion alert from the storage unit. I opened the app, my thumb hovering over the screen with a precision that betrayed my rising pulse. The feed flickered to life, showing the corrugated metal door of Unit 402 being shoved upward. Merritt entered, looking frantic and checking over his shoulder, as if the very air in the industrial hallway were haunted. He didn't look like the confident developer I'd seen at Christmas dinner. He looked like a man being hunted by his own choices. I watched in high definition as my son bypassed the stacks of legacy boxes containing his childhood toys and school yearbooks. He went straight for the remaining aerospace collectibles, his movements erratic and desperate. He pulled a heavy trunk forward, his breath visible in the cold storage air. My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a vice, the aortic stenosis, sending a sharp, acidic reminder of my own mortality through my chest. I watched him handle my NASA Distinguished Service Medal like it was a poker chip he was about to cash in. "Move faster, Michael. Move faster," I heard him whisper. The tablet's microphone caught the words with terrifying clarity. He wasn't even mourning the objects. He was just tallying the liquidity. It was an early inheritance, he muttered to the empty room, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. "He's going to die anyway. It's better that the money actually does some good now." My son's face, captured in the eerie green of night vision, looked less like my child and more like a ghost haunting the ruins of my life. The bile rose in the back of my throat, cold and acidic. I had engineered a test of his integrity, but I hadn't prepared for the absolute void I was discovering. I switched the feed. I needed to hear the other side of the failure. I accessed the audio bug in his home office, the muffled, distorted static slowly resolving into the sound of a voice. Merritt was on a phone call, his tone a mixture of groveling and panic. "I don't have the liquid cash right now. My dad's fund it's tied up in the hospital accounts," he said, his voice cracking. "Just give me until the weekend. I can cover the spread." 5 more days. I heard a muffled reply from the other end, a low growl of a voice that I didn't recognize. Merritt's hands were shaking so hard, I could hear the phone tapping against his cheek. I'm good for it. I've got assets moving as we speak. I felt the valve in my chest tighten, a mechanical protest against the poison pouring into my ears. Gambling isn't a game. It's a black hole. It doesn't matter how much light you throw into it. Nothing ever comes back out. He wasn't just stealing to maintain a lifestyle for Leonie. He was feeding a digital monster that ate $300,000 and was still hungry. The realization hit me with the force of a decompression event. My life-saving surgery wasn't delayed by a bad real estate market. It was being bet on a Sunday night football spread. I reached for my old address book, the scratchy feel of the paper a grounding sensation in the middle of my collapse. I realized that as an engineer, I could diagnose the structural failure, but as a father, I was too compromised to fix it. I was looking at a mission that was beyond my solo capacity. I needed a different kind of expert, someone who understood the anatomy of a lie, as well as I understood the anatomy of an engine. Have you ever watched someone you love dismantle your soul in real time? I don't recommend the resolution. It's far too clear. I turned the pages of the book, my fingers stopping at a name I hadn't called in years, Arlo Kendrick. Arlo was a man who lived in the gray spaces of the world, a former investigator who knew how to find what was hidden in the shadows. I picked up the handset, the weight of it feeling like a weapon. I realized that to survive this, I had to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a commander managing a recovery mission. I dialed the number, my voice steadying, as the technical side of my brain took over the navigation. Arlo, it's Thane, I said, when the line finally clicked open. I have a structural failure in progress. I need your eyes on it. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of a match being struck, and a long, slow exhale of smoke. I heard you were sick. Thane Arlo replied, his voice a low rumble. How bad is the damage? It's terminal if I don't vent the pressure soon, I said, looking at the screen where Merritt was currently using my own social security number on a laptop to open a new line of credit. He's digging a hole, Arlo, and he's using my bones as the shovel. I discovered the credit application, then a secondary window on my monitoring software that showed the digital trail of my identity being stripped for parts. Merritt wasn't just stealing my money, he was stealing my future. I watched the screen as Merritt tucked my NASA Distinguished Service Medal into his pocket, unaware that I wasn't just watching him steal, I was watching him sign his own indictment. I slid into the vinyl booth of the Blue Star Diner, the scent of burnt coffee and cheap grease, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital halls I'd been haunting. The morning light filtered through the grit-filmed windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a Formica tabletop that had seen better decades. I wasn't here for the breakfast special. I was here because the mechanical valve in my chest was failing, and the man I had raised was the one who had cut the power. Arlo Kendrick, 59, and a former FBI field agent who I'd played chess with for a decade at the community center, slid into the booth with the practiced ease of a predator. He didn't look like a retiree. He looked like a man who was always measuring the distance to the nearest exit. He wore a windbreaker that was slightly too large, perfect for concealing things, and his eyes were sharp enough to pin a fly to the wall. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a handshake. He just looked at the way my hands were resting on the table, the slight tremor I couldn't quite mask. You look like a man whose heat shield is about to flake off, Thane, he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the rhythmic clinking of a waitress's spoon against a ceramic mug. I took a slow breath, feeling the resistance in my lungs. I have a leak in the structure, Arlo. A big one, and it's coming from inside the cockpit. Arlo didn't blink. He just leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the diner for anyone listening. He revealed something then that made my pulse skip. He told me he'd been watching Merritt from a distance for a week. He'd noticed my health declining during our chess matches and saw how Merritt's frequent nervous visits to my place coincided with my growing exhaustion. He'd suspected a parasitic drain on my resources before I'd even found the courage to admit it to myself. Arlo looked at me the way a recovery crew looks at a black box recovered from the bottom of the ocean, with a mixture of grim curiosity and deep respect for what survived the crash. I've seen the way he carries himself, Thane, like he's trying to walk on eggshells while wearing lead boots. I didn't waste time on excuses. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a metal thumb drive, placing it on the table. It felt cold and heavy, a concentrated block of digital betrayal. This isn't just a theft, Arlo. It's a calculated abandonment. I explained the golden window for my surgery, the 60-day countdown that was rapidly approaching zero. I told him about the $320,000, the missing medals, and the pawnshop receipt. Arlo took out a ruggedized tablet plugged in the drive and began to scroll. The screen reflected in his eyes as he watched the grainy footage of Merritt looting the storage unit. His face hardened, the skin around his jaw tightening into a professional mask. "I've chased cartel hitmen with more soul than what I'm seeing on this screen," he whispered. The waitress refilled our cups. The steam rose. Between us, the air felt thick enough to suffocate. I watched a drop of condensation slide down the side of a water glass, thinking about how easily my son had discarded 40 years of my life for a digital bet. Arlo's silence was worse than a lecture. It was the silence of a man calculating the most efficient way to dismantle a target. He finally looked up, the tablet screen going dark. "You're asking me to hunt your blood, Thane. You understand what that means?" I didn't flinch. "I want the telemetry, Arlo. I need a complete flight path of where that money went. No deviations. I want a full financial tracing of Merritt's accounts. I want the location of every pawned heirloom. And I want the names of the loan sharks he's groveling to." I laid out the mission parameters with the cold precision of a NASA launch protocol. I specified the checkpoints. I defined the no-go criteria. I wasn't a father in that moment. I was a lead engineer trying to save a failing mission from total destruction. Arlo watched me, a flicker of something like respect crossing his weathered face. "Consider the sensors deployed, Thane. We're going to find every crack in his hull." He didn't ask for a retainer. He didn't ask about the risk. He simply reached for the thumb drive and pocketed it. You don't hire a man like Arlo Kendrick to talk you out of a problem. You hire him to incinerate it. We sat there for a few more minutes, the grit of sugar on the Formica tabletop crunching under my sleeves as I leaned forward. I had one more piece of data to provide, the one that would allow Arlo to bypass Merritt's digital defenses. I handed him a second encrypted file on a slip of paper. It contained Merritt's residential security codes. I'd helped him set up the system 3 years ago, and I had never removed my administrator backdoor access. It was a failure in Merritt's personal security, a microscopic crack I was now going to exploit. Arlo's eyebrows twitched upward. "You always were thorough, Thane. I'll start with the gambling accounts. If he's using your social security number, he's left a trail a mile wide." He stood up then, the red vinyl booth squeaking as he slid out. He looked down at me, his hand resting on the pocket where the thumb drive sat. "If we do this, Thane, there's no coming back. You're not just investigating a thief. You're hunting your only son." I looked at the dark residue in the bottom of my coffee cup, the bitter dregs of a life I thought was secure. He stopped being my son when he started counting my remaining breaths as profit. "Just find the money, Arlo. I'll handle the rest." I watched him walk out, his figure blending into the morning crowd, with the anonymity of a ghost, leaving me alone with the ticking in my chest and the cold, hard certainty that the hunt had officially begun. Data doesn't have a heart, which is why it's the only thing I can trust to tell me the truth about my son's soul. 10 days had passed since our meeting at the Blue Star Diner, 10 days of excruciating silence, where the only thing keeping me upright was the rhythmic, clinical ticking of the clock in my hallway and the stubborn belief that Arlo would find the missing variables in Merritt's equation. When the knock finally came at my door, I didn't rush. I moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man whose structural integrity was nearing the breaking point. Arlo Kendrick stood in the hallway, the scent of a tobacco-heavy coat clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't offer a greeting. He just held up a thick manila folder, his expression uncharacteristically somber. I stepped aside, and he walked in, placing the dossier on the coffee table with a sound that seemed too heavy for mere paper. "It's ugly, Thane," he said, sitting on the edge of my sofa. "Worse than we thought." He watched me as I reached for the folder, my fingers feeling cold and slightly numb. "Just give me the numbers, Arlo. I'm an engineer. I deal in hard data, not metaphors." I opened the file, and the first thing I saw wasn't a bank statement, but a rejection notice for a life insurance policy. Merritt had tried to take out a high-value policy on me just weeks after my diagnosis, naming himself as the sole beneficiary. He'd been rejected because of my pre-existing condition, but the intent was as clear as a blueprint. He wasn't just waiting for me to die. He'd tried to find a way to make it even more profitable. Reading these bank statements was like watching a slow-motion video of a satellite deorbiting. You know it's going to burn up. You're just waiting for the first spark. Arlo had compiled a meticulous timeline of Merritt's descent into the black hole of high-stakes online gambling. It started with small transfers, 500 here, 1,000 there. But the event horizon had expanded with terrifying speed. I saw the transaction logs from DraftKings FanDuel and half a dozen offshore poker sites. Merritt wasn't just losing money. He was incinerating it. The most devastating data point was the surge in activity immediately following my $320,000 transfer. He hadn't used that money to bridge a gap in his business. He used the life-saving funds I'd handed him to chase losses from the previous year. He didn't just spend it on a lifestyle, Thane Arlo said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He bet your heartbeat on a parlay for a Sunday night football game. I felt the cold, acidic sweat on my palms as I flipped to the next page. I gave him my survival. He used it as a chip. 312,000. The number sat on the page like a bloodstain. It was almost exactly the amount I needed for the University of Colorado hospital. Merritt hadn't just dipped into the fund. He had emptied the reservoir. I felt the sharp, paper-cut sting of the dossier pages against my thumb. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow vacuum opening up in my chest. Arlo reached over and flipped the page for me, revealing the final section of the report. This was the part that explained the frantic phone calls and the second phone I'd seen in Merritt's pocket. It was a collection of printed emails and text messages from individuals Arlo identified as underground loan sharks. These weren't corporate entities. These were predators who didn't care about family ties or heart conditions. Merritt owed them an additional $180,000. My son's silence wasn't just guilt, it was terror. He was being hunted by people who viewed me not as a person, but as a bank with a finite expiration date. "These people have been watching your apartment," Thane Arlo said, leaning forward. "They know who you are. They think you're the one holding the collateral. They think you're the bank." I looked at the grainy black and white print of the threats Merritt had received. One message sent just 3 days ago chilled me to the marrow. Merritt had written back to a shark named V. "The old man is on his last legs. The house and the remaining accounts will clear everything within the quarter." He was already liquidating my life in his head. He was counting on my death to pay for his bets. "Let them watch," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "They're about to find out the vault is empty, and the architect is still armed." I looked at the digital clock on the wall. The red numbers blinked with a mechanical indifference. My surgical window was closing, and Merritt had already spent the money that should have bought me more time. But he had forgotten something crucial about the man who raised him. An engineer always builds redundancy into the system. Arlo stayed silent, giving me the space to process the wreckage. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, but my mind clearing into a surgical, vengeful clarity. The grief was still there, a dull ache behind my narrowing aortic valve. but it was being overridden by the technical necessity of survival. "Michael thinks he can calculate my end date," I whispered, but he forgot who taught him how to read a graph. I realized then that my mission had changed. I was no longer an engineer trying to fix a broken family structure. I was a man in an airless room who had to manufacture his own oxygen before the pressure crushed him. I had to stop acting like a victim and start acting like a commander managing a recovery mission. The path forward was clear, now lit by the cold light of the data Arlo had brought me. My son had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. I didn't cry. Grief is a luxury for those with time, and according to the diagnostic telemetry of my own heart, I was running on fumes. The dossier Arlo had left behind sat on my desk, a physical manifestation of the wreckage Merritt had made of my life. I watched the digital clock on the wall blink in the quiet of my home office, the red numbers mocking the countdown I was racing against. My son wasn't just a thief. He was a scavenger waiting for the carcass to cool. But I was still warm, and as long as that failing valve kept pumping, I had a mission to execute. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the blue light reflecting off my reading glasses and illuminating the stale smell of cold coffee that had been sitting there since Arlo left. I launched Excel and created a new workbook, the rhythmic clicking of the keys sounding like a drum beat in the silence. I titled it Operation Survival. It was a name that felt appropriate for a man who had spent 40 years ensuring other people didn't die in the vacuum of space. Now I had to ensure I didn't die in the vacuum of my own family. I began mapping out the mission parameters with the cold, surgical precision of a NASA flight director. I listed the critical path, the $150,000 required for the hospital's minimum upfront payment to keep the surgery slot. Then I calculated the daily burn rate of my remaining physical stamina against the timeline. The math was brutal. I had weeks, not months, and every day Merritt stalled was a day closer to total system failure. Emotions are like solar flares. They're spectacular, they're hot, and if you let them into the cockpit, they'll fry every instrument you have. I pushed the image of Merritt's gambling notifications out of my mind and focused on the digits. I had one asset Merritt didn't know about. Years ago, I'd set up a black box savings account in my late wife's name, Sarah Hayes Garrison. It was a tiny emergency fund, only $5,000, but it had remained untouched for 5 years. It was a microscopic seed, but it was mine. It was the only part of my hull Merritt hadn't managed to strip for parts. I looked at the $5,000 balance and felt a flicker of hope. It was enough for the surveillance gear I'd already purchased, but not enough for the heart. Structural integrity compromised. Funding depleted. Objective absolute survival. I started scanning the horizon for redundant systems. Redundancy is the cornerstone of aerospace engineering. If one line fails, you have another waiting to take the load. Merritt thinks he left me on a dead planet with no oxygen. He forgot I spent 40 years building life support systems for people who were actually in space. I began listing the backups: old friends from the propulsion labs, retired colleagues from the Apollo and shuttle eras, and even a brother in Ohio I hadn't spoken to since Sarah's funeral. I treated these relationships like electrical circuits, assessing which ones were still operational and capable of handling a heavy current. I couldn't just ask for charity. I knew these men, and I knew how their minds worked. I decided I wouldn't just ask for loans. I was going to offer my NASA-era consulting expertise to their current firms in exchange for accelerated advances. I was turning my survival into a business transaction. It was a strategy that protected my pride and provided a logical reason for the sudden need for cash that wouldn't lead back to Merritt's betrayal. I hit save. The file name sat there black and white. Operation Survival. It was a mission I was never trained for, but I was the only pilot left. The dry, rasping sound of my own breath in the quiet office reminded me that the clock was still ticking. I moved to the secrecy protocol. This was the most dangerous part of the flight. Merritt had to believe the status quo remained unchanged. If he suspects I'm fighting back, he'll accelerate, I muttered to the empty room. If he thinks I'm already dead, he'll get sloppy. I set up an encrypted communication bridge with Arlo and established a secondary secret bank account using Sarah's maiden name. I prepared a script for the upcoming calls, ensuring my engineering voice, that calm, steady monotone that had seen me through a dozen engine failures, didn't betray the medical emergency. I couldn't let them hear the stenosis in my tone. Target $150,000. Timeline 120 hours. That was the goal for the first phase of the funding. Anything less was a total mission failure. What is a man worth when his bank balance is zero, but his mind is still a fortress of equations? I was about to find out. I felt the tactile resistance of the phone's keypad as I picked it up. My hands were steady. The icy focus had taken over the part of me that knew how to calculate a re-entry trajectory, even when the heat shield was flaking off. I was no longer a victim. I was a commander managing a recovery mission. I looked at the first name on my funding sources list, Cassius Dalton, a man who owed me his career and quite possibly his life. I had a list of men who still remembered what the name Thane Garrison meant in a room full of propulsion engineers. The mission parameters were set. The target was locked, and the countdown had begun. It's a strange thing to realize that the colleagues you haven't spoken to in a decade value your life more than the man who carries your last name. I sat in my home office, the blue-white light of the spreadsheet, reflecting off my glasses like a terminal screen in a launch control center. The smell of old paper and lukewarm tea filled the small room, a domestic scene that felt entirely disconnected from the war of survival I was currently waging. I had 19 days left of fuel, but my son had spent the budget on a lifestyle built on sand. I took a slow, measured breath, feeling the sharp, rhythmic pulsing of the heart monitor app on my phone, a digital reminder that my biology was a failing machine. I reached for the handset. The weight of it was familiar and heavy, a tool of communication I was about to use as a lever to move the world. Cassius Dalton, a retired Air Force colonel, with a voice like gravel in a blender and a sense of loyalty forged in the heat of a dozen failed test flights, answered on the second ring. "Cassius," I said, keeping my tone as level as a horizon line. "It's Thane Garrison." There was a pause, a dry rasp of a breath on the other end. "Thane, it's been a long time. I heard you were dealing with some structural issues." "Word travels fast in the propulsion community," I replied. "I'm consulting on an urgent private structural project, Cassius. I've hit a temporary liquidity bridge issue. I need 30,000. I expected questions. I expected hesitation. Instead, I heard the scratch of a pen. "Thane, you saved my hide when the X-14 line blew in '98 and the brass wanted my stars. You want 30, you've got it. Just tell me where to wire it." I felt a surge of humbling support that nearly cracked my surgical focus. My own son was betting on my death, but the Air Force was betting on my life. "I'm moving fast on this, Cassius. No room for drag." "Consider the gears turned," he replied. "I'll have the telemetry confirmed by noon." Click. Wire confirmed. Another 30,000 in the survival column. I sat in the silence for a moment, realizing that one of my old colleagues, a man I'd once thought was a rival for a promotion at JPL, had actually set aside a disaster fund years ago specifically to help old NASA vets. He had reached out via email the moment he heard I was making calls, speeding up my funding by 2 full days. It was a redundancy system I hadn't even calculated into the mission profile. I spent the next 6 hours on the phone, a methodical harvest of loyalty and respect. I called 3 other former NASA colleagues, men who had sat in the trenches of mission control with me, while we watched billion-dollar dreams either reach orbit or burn up in the atmosphere. I utilized the consulting advanced strategy I'd mapped out, securing 20,000 from one and 40,000 from another. Why is it easier to ask a stranger for a fortune than to ask your own son for the truth? Each call reinforced the contrast between these men who respected my legacy enough to fund it blindly, and Merritt, who viewed that same legacy as a cash-out opportunity. "We take care of our own thing," my old mentor had said before hanging up. "NASA families don't let their engineers go offline." By late afternoon, the mission was back on the rails. The survival column showed $150,000. The payload was ready. I dialed the University of Colorado Hospital's billing department, my fingers steady, despite the vice-like squeeze beginning to tighten in my chest. I asked for a supervisor, knowing a frontline clerk wouldn't have the authority to override a scheduled cardiac slot. "I have the $150,000 ready for wire." I said, my voice clinical and detached, as if I were discussing a budget line for a satellite repair. "I need to move the slot to the 27th. I listened to the tapping of keys on the other end. "Mr. Garrison, that's quite a significant shift. We usually require 10 days lead time for cardiac rescheduling." "We aren't dealing with a usual situation," I countered. "The funding is secured via a private trust. I need that window." I was building a secondary life support loop in the dark, hoping the primary system wouldn't notice the pressure drop until I was safely out of the airlock. It was precision under extreme pressure, a technical negotiation where my own heartbeat was the collateral. Finally, the supervisor relented. The green light appeared on my internal HUD, slot confirmed. November 27th. The golden window was still open. I leaned back in my chair, the cold metallic click of the phone being hung up, sounding like the locking of a docking collar. I had done it. I had bypassed my son's sabotage and re-engineered my own survival. I stared at the confirmation number on the screen, the date November 27th, glowing in green. The mission was a go, but then my phone vibrated with a text from Arlo that made my blood run cold. "Merritt knows you're moving money. He's coming to your apartment." I felt the familiar acidic spike of adrenaline. I checked my private portal and saw the notification Arlo was talking about. Merritt had just tried to access my primary retirement account using a forged power of attorney. He had no idea I'd already frozen it 48 hours prior, a proactive strike he was now slamming into like a brick wall. He was desperate. He was hungry. And he was right outside my door. I looked at the heart monitor app. My pulse was climbing. I had to regulate the system. I had to face him without letting him see the surgical scar I was about to earn. I stood up, smoothing my shirt, readying my engineering voice for the most difficult performance of my life. I shoved the University of Colorado folder under a stack of vintage National Geographics, just as the deadbolt clicked a sound that used to mean family was home, but now sounded like a breach in the airlock. My heart hammered against my ribs, a jagged and uneven rhythm that the narrowing aortic valve struggled to translate into steady flow. I forced my hands to stop shaking, smoothing the front of my shirt and taking a seat at the kitchen table. I had to be an engineer now, projecting a facade of structural stability, while the foundation was being hollowed out from beneath me. Merritt stepped into the apartment, his face a mask of aggressive suspicion. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He simply threw his keys on the counter and loomed over the table. "Why is the Vanguard account locked, Dad?" he demanded, his voice tight with a desperate, hungry edge. "I tried to move some equity this morning for the Highland closure, and the system flagged it." I looked up at him, keeping my gaze as level as a horizon line. "I locked it, Merritt. I'm tired of the city and the noise. I've decided to go up to the Frying Pan River for a week. A solo fishing trip. No cell service, just trout and silence. I needed to liquidate some assets to fund the final adventure. I'm taking some time to clear my head before we sort out the rest of the money when I return." I saw the flash of greed in his eyes, the way his jaw slackened, just enough to show the calculation running behind his pupils. He thought I was finally yielding, that this trip was the beginning of the end. "You can't just lock the accounts, Dad. I had plans for that equity," he muttered, though the aggression was losing its steam, replaced by the scent of a potential windfall. "Just go then. Clear your head. We'll talk about the transfer the moment you're back. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you raised and seen only the calculation of your net worth? It's a colder sight than a Colorado winter. I'd set a honeypot trap. Before he arrived, a small, accessible account with exactly $2,000. I knew the moment I left, he wouldn't be able to resist it. It was a digital sensor, a tripwire that would notify Arlo the second Merritt reached for it, proving once and for all that his desperation had overridden his soul. I watched him leave the door, clicking shut, with a finality that made the apartment feel like a tomb. I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, not with lures and high-test line, but with a hospital gown, slippers, and the courage of a man who was out of options. I drove myself to the University of Colorado Hospital in the pre-dawn cold of November 27th, the heater in my old car barely making a dent in the chill. The clinical ritual of the prep was an exercise in stripping away dignity. Nurse Elena, a woman with hands that smelled of lavender and latex, moved with the efficient grace of a flight controller as she checked my vitals. She looked at the empty chair beside my bed, and then back at my chart. "No family with you today, Mr. Garrison?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. I looked at the white tile ceiling, focusing on the hum of the HVAC system. "I'm a solo flyer, nurse. Just get the systems ready for launch." The needle went in. Cold. Precise. The first step of a journey Merritt assumed I'd never take. I felt the iodine scrub on my chest, the cold pressure of the ID bracelets being snapped onto my wrists. I was being prepared like a shuttle for a one-way mission, where I was both the pilot and the payload. I was terrified, yet there was a strange, analytical peace in the surrender. I had engineered this moment in secret, bypassing the sabotage of my own blood, to ensure that my heart would keep ticking, even if it had to do so with a mechanical valve made of carbon and steel. The orderlies arrived to wheel me toward the surgical wing. The hallway lights passed overhead in a rhythmic strobe of fluorescent white. I was moved into the operating room, a temple of stainless steel and blue light, a place where orbital mechanics were replaced by the delicate plumbing of the human heart. I observed the mechanical precision of the heart-lung machine, the array of scalpels and the monitors waiting to track my descent into a controlled clinical death. Dr. Thorne stood there, his masked face unreadable but his eyes steady. "Countdown from 10 for me, Thane. See you on the other side." 10, 9, 8. The anesthesiologist leaned over me, the sedative entering my system like a wave of liquid shadow. Just as the darkness began to cloud my mind, I heard a muffled conversation between two nurses near the equipment rack. They were discussing the paperwork for my next of kin. Arlo's wife, a retired nurse I had met only once, had checked in under a pseudonym. She was standing watch in the waiting room, a silent guardian, ensuring that if Merritt came looking for his inheritance early, he would find a wall he couldn't climb. It was the final redundancy in my plan, a human heat shield for the man who was currently losing consciousness. The lights above the table began to blur into a single blinding sun, and as the darkness rushed in to claim me, I realized the last thing I had done before falling asleep was lie to the only person who was supposed to care if I ever woke up again. I had built a life support loop in the dark, and now I was drifting into the void, trusting the hardware and the hands of strangers to bring me back to a world where I was officially and finally alone. Waking up from open-heart surgery feels like being reassembled by a blind mechanic who forgot half the screws. Everything hurts and nothing fits. My first gasping breath after they pulled the ventilator tube felt like swallowing ground glass, a sharp, ragged reminder that my lungs were having to learn the mechanics of expansion all over again. I opened my eyes to the rhythmic wheeze of machines and the persistent clinical beep of monitors that defined the cardiac ICU at the University of Colorado Hospital. I didn't move. I couldn't. I simply lay there, identifying my pain clinically, as if I were reading a telemetry report on a failing hull. The primary ache was central, a deep structural throb where they had cracked my sternum to reach the engine room. But beneath that, there was a new sensation. A rhythmic, metallic tick-tock echoed through my bones, vibrating in my jaw. It was the mechanical valve. The pump was operational. I had survived by my own hand and the loyalty of men who weren't even my kin. I saw a figure standing by the bed, silhouetted against the harsh blue light of the vitals monitor. Arlo's wife, a retired nurse with a gaze that could spot a lie, or a lethal arrhythmia from across the room, stood by my bed like a silent guardian. She leaned in her hands, smelling of antiseptic and lavender, as she checked the line in my neck. "It's ticking," I whispered, my voice a dry, rasping ghost of what it used to be. "The pump is operational." "Rest Thane," she replied, her voice a steady anchor in the morphine fog. "You're back on the grid. We've got the perimeter secured. Arlo is monitoring the accounts. Just breathe." I surrendered to the exhaustion, drifting through a blur of days where time was measured in catheter bags and physical therapy milestones. Is there anything louder than a phone that refuses to ring when you're tethered to a life support machine? I kept my phone on the bedside table, watching it like a sensor for signs of life from the world I had left behind. Arlo sent occasional updates, brief and tactical. Merritt had indeed triggered the alert on the honeypot account, draining the $2,000 within hours of my supposed departure for the river. He had been to the bank twice, more likely trying to find a way past the freeze on the retirement fund. But as the days bled into a week, then two, the one thing I waited for never arrived. There was not a single missed call from my son. No text asking if the fish were biting. No message wondering why I hadn't checked in. The monitor flatlined. Not my heart, my hope. My son was officially a ghost. I spent my recovery in a silence so profound, it felt like the vacuum of deep space. By the time the staples were ready to come out, I was walking the halls of the recovery ward, my hand pressed to my chest to steady the mechanical thrum. I was a decommissioned satellite, finally finding its own orbit, while the world I left behind thought I'd already burned up on re-entry. Arlo's wife remained my only visitor, a stoic proxy for a family that had already buried me in their minds. The isolation should have broken me, but instead it tempered me. Each day Merritt didn't call was another data point proving the necessity of my cold, hard resolve. Before I explain what that hospital phone log truly means for Merritt's future, I want to see how you're reading this. Comment 2 if you think I should give him one last chance to confess. Or 4 if I should cut him off forever and add one short reason why. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to deepen the emotional impact. If you'd rather not continue with these dramatized details, feel free to pause or click away now. I was finally cleared for discharge on December 20th. As I sat in the discharge lounge dressed in my own clothes for the first time in weeks, I asked the administrative nurse for a printout of the incoming call logs to my room and the primary hospital switchboard. I needed the final calculation. I needed to know if at any point during the golden window Michael had reached out. I scanned the list, my eyes skipping over Arlo's masked numbers and the billing department's internal extensions. My son had never called the hospital to check on me. He had never called the ranger station at the Frying Pan River to see if a man of my age had been reported missing in the wilderness. He hadn't even tried to reach me on December 1st, the day he knew my life-saving deposit was due. However, Arlo had found one specific outgoing call from Merritt's office to the hospital's billing department. Merritt hadn't called to check on my health. He had called to check on the billing status, hoping to confirm the surgery had been canceled so he could breathe easy about the money he'd stolen. He wasn't waiting for me to come home. He was waiting for the house to be vacant. I looked at the discharge papers, the ink still wet, and I realized that while the hospital was letting me go, I was the one who was finally cutting the cord. The golden window was closed, but I was still standing, and the mechanical valve in my chest was ticking like a bomb I was about to drop on his doorstep. Walking into my son's home on Christmas Eve felt less like a holiday visit, and more like entering an observation chamber where the subject was unaware the glass had been turned into a mirror. I stood in the foyer, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, and for a moment I simply listened. The house was filled with the artificial warmth of a high-end furnace and the scent of roasted rosemary, but the air felt thin, as if the structural integrity of the Garrison name was finally beginning to buckle under the atmospheric pressure of 1,000 lies. I smoothed the front of my charcoal wool jacket, feeling the slight rectangular weight of the digital recorder pinned to the inside lining. It was a secondary sensor, a fail-safe to ensure that every syllable of the upcoming collapse was documented for the police report, already sitting in my lawyer's outbox. "Thane, you're back." Merritt's voice erupted from the living room, but it was pitched an octave too high. The sound of a man whose landing gear had failed, but was trying to convince the tower he was on a perfect glide path. He practically ran into the foyer, and for a split second I saw it, the raw, naked shock that I was actually standing there. He looked like he'd seen a man risen from the grave, his face paling to the color of unpolished titanium before he forced a smile into place. "How was the fishing trip?" We were getting worried. "Quiet, Michael," I said, using the name I only reserved for moments of critical failure. "The river was cold, but it has a way of washing away the sediment. I feel like a new man." I stepped past him, my stride steady and purposeful. I felt the mechanical pulse of my new valve against my ribs, a secret ticking clock in a room full of liars. He looked at me with the wide-eyed terror of a pilot realizing his landing gear has failed, but I wasn't the control tower anymore. I was the mountain he was about to hit. Leonie appeared from the kitchen, her phone grafted to her palm as usual. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, her influencer smile perfectly calibrated for the ring light. "Thane, you're just in time. Dinner is perfect. We're celebrating Merritt's biggest quarter yet." She didn't even notice the way Merritt's hands were shaking as he reached for my coat. Dinner was a masterclass in the Last Supper of lies. The turkey was served on fine china glistening under the crystal chandelier, but the opulence felt like a heat shield designed to hide the fact that the ship was already burning. I sat across from them, ignoring the wine Merritt tried to pour with a reedy, nervous energy. Leonie spent the first 20 minutes bragging about her latest networking event, a lavish party at the Botanical Gardens that I now knew had been funded by the very blood in my veins. She spoke about engagement metrics and brand synergy, while Merritt sat beside her, barely touching his food, his eyes darting toward me every time I cleared my throat. "Do you know how much effort it takes to lie to a man who literally designed the systems that catch failures? It's a fool's errand, and Michael was the king of fools." I let them ramble for a while, gathering the final data points of their hubris. Finally, I set my fork down with a deliberate clink against the porcelain. "Michael, did the hospital send that confirmation letter?" I asked, my voice as level as a horizon line. "The one regarding the December 1st payment deadline." The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a total loss of cabin pressure. Leonie stopped scrolling her phone, hovering inches from her face. Merritt's jaw worked back and forth, a silent engine trying to turn over in a vacuum. Yes, I think there was some paperwork, Dad," he stammered, his skin turning a sickly gray. "Everything is handled. The fund is fine. Let's just eat." I reached into my leather satchel, which I had placed on the empty chair beside me. I didn't reach for my wallet or a gift. I pulled out my laptop and set it directly onto the table, shoving the gravy boat aside to make room. The screen flickered. Green tint. Grainy movement. The star of the show was my son, and the genre was grand larceny. I turned the screen to face them. "Since you seem so confused about the paperwork, Michael, I brought some clarity. I think you'll recognize the cinematography." I pressed a key, and the infrared footage from Unit 402 filled the room. The quality was high definition, capturing every desperate line on Merritt's face as he shoved my late wife's gold wedding ring into his side pocket. "You said you hadn't been to the storage unit in months, Michael. My cameras disagree." "Dad, what is this?" Merritt shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to stand. You're being paranoid again." This is a violation. I sat perfectly still watching the grainy image of my son looting my heritage. The warm, festive air didn't just cool, it crystallized. I didn't mention the loan sharks yet. I didn't mention the DraftKings logs, or the fact that Arlo was currently parked in an SUV outside, having hijacked the house's Wi-Fi to ensure that Merritt couldn't delete a single offshore account from his personal computer. I just watched the video play. I watched the moment Merritt looked at the camera lens hidden inside a hollowed-out bolt he never noticed, and I saw the exact second he realized the game was over. I pressed play again, and the grainy image of Merritt shoving my late wife's gold wedding ring into his pocket filled the screen. The silence in the room finally shattering like glass under a hammer. Leonie stared at the screen, her mouth hanging open, the Rolex on her wrist, catching the blue light of the laptop like a beacon of the theft she had encouraged. The trap was sprung, and for the first time in 14 months I could finally breathe. Betrayal has a specific frequency, a high-pitched whine that drowns out everything else until the only thing left to hear is the rhythmic ticking of a mechanical heart valve. The video on the laptop screen ended, leaving a frozen image of Merritt's guilt etched in grainy pixels. I watched the blood drain from my son's face, his eyes fixed on the device as if he expected it to burst into flames. Leonie sat paralyzed, her hand clutching the stem of a wine glass so tightly I expected the crystal to shatter. The silence in the dining room was absolute heavy, with the weight of cold turkey and expensive wasted wine. I didn't give Merritt time to formulate a lie or recover from the shock of seeing himself on camera stealing from his dying father. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket, my fingers closing around a small velvet box that had been resting against my chest since I walked through his door tonight. The weight of it felt heavier than the mechanical valve ticking in my sternum. I pulled it out slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the white linen tablecloth. The dark blue velvet seemed to absorb the festive Christmas lights, a small, quiet rectangle of judgment sitting between the gravy boat and Merritt's untouched plate. His eyes locked onto the box immediately. His face, already pale from watching the security footage, turned the color of fresh snow. "Open it, Michael!" I said, my voice as flat and emotionless as a mission control readout during a systems failure. His fingers fumbled with the small brass clasp. The lid flipped open with a soft creak, and there, nestled in the white silk lining, like a fragile artifact recovered from a wreck, was my late wife's gold wedding ring. The simple band caught the light from the crystal chandelier above, gleaming with a warmth that mocked the coldness spreading through the room. But I sold that," Merritt whispered, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. "Dad, how did you—" "I saw the transaction." The jeweler confirmed it was melted down. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded calmly on the table. "Let me tell you a story, Merritt. 3 days after you pawned your mother's wedding ring for $3,800, I received a phone call that changed everything. The call came from Bernard Weaver, the jeweler on Larimer Street. Do you remember him? Of course you don't. You were too young when I first walked into his shop 42 years ago, with 2 months' salary saved up looking for the perfect ring for the woman I loved. Bernard remembered me. He remembered the inscription I had him engrave on the inside of that band. To Sarah, my North Star. So when a man in his 40s walked into his shop and tried to sell that ring as scrap gold to be melted down, Bernard didn't just process the transaction. He called me first. I paid $5,500 to buy back the ring you sold for $3,800. Bernard gave me what he called a family discount. He told me he couldn't bear the thought of that particular ring being destroyed. I reached across the table and picked up the ring, holding it between my thumb and forefinger, so the Christmas lights danced across the gold surface. Your mother wore this ring for 38 years, Merritt. She wore it through 3 decades of NASA launches, through every sleepless night when I was away on mission support. She wore it the day you were born, and she was wearing it the day the oncologist told us there was nothing more they could do. She wore it through every round of chemotherapy even when her fingers swelled so badly from the medication that I had to help her take it off at night. And you sold it for $3,800 so you could place another bet on a football game. Merritt's face crumpled. Tears began to stream down his cheeks, but I wasn't finished. But the ring wasn't the only thing I recovered. I reached into my satchel and pulled out a small bound ledger. After Bernard called me, I hired a forensic accountant who specializes in tracking stolen goods. It took him 72 hours and cost me $5,000, but he found everything. I opened the ledger and read aloud like a damage assessment report. October 3rd, you stole my 40-year stamp collection, the one I started the year you were born. You sold it to a collector in Boulder for $6,000. I paid him $8,000 to buy it back. He included a handwritten apology for purchasing what he called obviously stolen family heirlooms. I flipped the page. October 18th, the Leica camera that was a gift from your mother on our 30th anniversary. You sold it on eBay for $5,500. I tracked down the buyer in California and paid $6,200 to have it shipped back overnight. I flipped to the final page. October 29th, my NASA Distinguished Service Medal, 40 years of service. You sold it for $2,500. When I contacted the collector and explained what happened, he refused payment. He mailed it back with a note. A man who would steal his father's honors doesn't deserve to profit from them. Leonie was crying now, mascara running in dark streaks. Merritt sat with his face buried in his hands. In total, I said, standing and buttoning my jacket, I spent $23,200 recovering the pieces of my life that you sold. The only thing I couldn't recover was my Omega Speedmaster watch. That watch is gone forever. Just like the son I thought I raised. I placed the ring back into the velvet box and snapped it shut with finality. You didn't just steal from me. You sold your heritage. You sold your mother's memory. You turned your family into collateral for an addiction you were too weak to control. Merritt looked up, desperation on his face. Dad, please, I'm so sorry. I held up my hand. The time for apologies ended when you decided my heartbeat was something you could gamble with. What happens next isn't redemption. It's consequences. The sound of Merritt's sobbing broke the silence that followed the reveal of my scar. A hollow, wretched noise that did nothing to move the mechanical valve ticking steadily in my chest. I didn't give him time to breathe or find his footing in the ruins of his deception. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out the legal packet I had carried like a hidden weapon. The white envelope looked like a clean blade against the wine-stained tablecloth as I slid it across to him. I was no longer a father grieving a loss. I was an engineer decommissioned a faulty system. Inside that envelope, I explained as Merritt's trembling fingers fumbled with the seal, is a copy of the police report I filed 48 hours ago for elder financial abuse and grand larceny. My voice remained as level as a horizon line devoid of the heat that usually accompanies anger. Next to it, you will find a civil lawsuit for $418,000. The original $320,000 you stole, plus the costs of the secondary loans and recovery efforts I had to initiate to save my own life. Merritt's eyes darted over the heavy legal bond paper, the crinkle of the pages loud in the quiet room. He looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief. Dad, please. It's Christmas. You're making us homeless. I didn't flinch. You made that choice the moment you decided my heartbeat was a negotiable asset. But there is a third document, Merritt. A temporary restraining order and an eviction notice. You have 48 hours to vacate this property. He started to protest, mentioning the mortgage and his name on the deed, but I cut him off. That was the first lie you should have checked, I said. This house was never yours. I bought it through a quiet LLC years ago to give you a leg up when you were struggling with the firm. I was the secret landlord, and you were the tenant who defaulted on his humanity. Signature required. Not for love, for a felony. The realization hit him with the force of a decompression event. He wasn't just losing his father. He was losing the very ground he stood on. Merritt looked at Leonie, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, but Leonie was already calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She didn't offer a hand to her husband or a word of comfort. Instead, she stood up with a cold, terrifying clarity that almost made me respect her pragmatism. She looked at Merritt with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I'm not going to jail for your addiction, Merritt," she said, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "We're done." She didn't cry. She simply unclasped the gold Rolex from her wrist, the one I had watched her admire while I was dying, and dropped it onto the table. The metallic clink of the watch hitting the wood sounded like a period at the end of their marriage. Leonie didn't just leave. She performed an emergency jettison. She saw the ship was sinking, and she didn't care who was still strapped into the seats. She turned to me, her expression shifting into something she probably thought was an apology. "Thane, I had no idea he was stealing from your heart fund. I'm so sorry I was ever part of this." I didn't answer her. I didn't need her remorse. I watched her walk toward the bedroom, the muffled sound of a suitcase zipper echoing from down the hall minutes later. Merritt was on his knees now, the festive holiday lights reflecting in the tears streaming down his face. "Dad, don't leave me like this. I have nothing left." I stood up and began to button my shirt with steady, clinical fingers. I pulled on my heavy winter coat, the weight of the wool feeling like armor against the cold world I had just created. I looked down at him, and for the first time in 68 years, I felt no guilt. "I am no longer your father, Michael," I said, reaching for my satchel. "I am your creditor. The police will be conducting a follow-up interview on the 27th. I suggest you spend your remaining time in this house finding a lawyer who accepts cases with zero collateral. You think the snow is cold? Try standing in a room with a son who valued your last breath at the price of a Tesla down payment." I walked toward the front door, the air in the house feeling stagnant and poisoned. Merritt's pleas followed me, a frantic, incoherent stream of apologies that meant nothing now that the bank was closed. I stepped out onto the porch, and the crisp, biting smell of the December snow hit me like a benediction. I didn't look back. I didn't close the door softly. I walked to my car, my breath forming white puffs in the cold night air, and I looked at the house one last time. The lights were all on the garrison facade, glowing brilliantly in the dark, but inside the structure was hollow. Leonie appeared at the side door with 2 large suitcases, her heels clicking on the icy pavement as she marched toward her own car. As she passed me, she slowed down her eyes, darting to the house to ensure Merritt wasn't watching. "Thane, wait," she whispered, her voice low and hurried. "I have something you'll want. A hidden recording from last month. It's Merritt admitting he hoped you'd pass away quietly so the debt would vanish. I'll give it to you if you keep my name out of the civil suit." I looked at her, seeing the same predatory hunger that had ruined my son. It was a final betrayal, a gift offered in exchange for immunity. "Put it in my mailbox," I said, my voice as cold as the ice under my boots. "I'll decide what it's worth." I climbed into my car and started the engine. I watched Merritt through the front window, a small, broken figure silhouetted against the Christmas tree. I pulled the door shut behind me, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the crisp night air, the sound of a system finally perfectly isolated. I drove away, leaving the lights of the house behind my heart, ticking with a mechanical, perfect precision. Christmas morning arrived with the sterile, rhythmic ticking of the mechanical valve in my chest, a heartbeat I had paid for in blood gold, and the destruction of my only son's future. I lay in the gray light of my bedroom, listening to the clockwork pulse that was now my only companion. The confrontation at Merritt's house felt both distant and immediate, like a launch that had ended in flames. I sat up slowly, feeling the pull of the healing incision, and reached for my phone. The screen showed no missed calls, just the date, December 25th, 2024. I was 70 years old, spending Christmas completely alone for the first time in my life. I made black coffee, the bitter taste matching my mood, and stood at the kitchen window watching cars drive by, with families heading to gatherings I would never attend again. The isolation should have felt crushing, but instead it felt like the clean vacuum of space, empty but pure. At exactly 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a Denver number I didn't recognize. I answered on the second ring. Mr. Garrison, a woman's voice said, crisp and professional. This is Detective Linda Martinez with the Denver Police Department Financial Crimes and Elder Abuse Division. I apologize for calling on Christmas morning, but I wanted to reach you personally while I had a quiet moment. Detective Martinez, I replied, setting down my coffee. I appreciate the call. First, let me say I've been assigned as lead investigator on your case. I spent yesterday reviewing the evidence package you and your attorney submitted. In 15 years on this job, I have never seen a more thoroughly documented case of elder financial abuse. The security footage, the private investigators' reports, the bank logs, it's all airtight. I felt vindication mixed with sadness. I'm an engineer detective. Documentation is what I do. Your engineering background shows, and it's going to make my job easier. Your son's public defender will have a difficult time mounting any defense against this level of evidence. I closed my eyes, leaning against the counter. What are the next steps? I'll be conducting a formal interview with your son on December 27th. I've coordinated with his attorney. Given the evidence strength and his admission during your Christmas Eve confrontation, I expect he'll waive his right to silence and provide a full statement. That will expedite everything. And the criminal charges we're filing 2 felony counts by week's end. Count 1 grand larceny class, 3 felony for theft of $320,000. Count 2 financial exploitation of an at-risk adult under the elder abuse statute. That's actually the more serious charge, because it involves exploitation of someone with a life-threatening condition. What kind of sentence? Detective Martinez took a slow breath. Realistically, cases like this rarely go to trial. Your son has no prior record. His attorney will negotiate a plea agreement. The DA will likely offer a suspended sentence, probation, instead of prison, in exchange for guilty plea, mandatory gambling treatment, community service, and full restitution. So no prison time. Not unless he violates probation terms. But don't mistake a suspended sentence for leniency. He'll be under court supervision for years. Monthly probation officer meetings, random financial audits. If he places a single bet during that period, he goes to jail. It's a long leash, but the state holds the other end. What about the loan sharks? That's where things get complicated and dangerous. We've forwarded the threatening emails and financial records to the FBI's Cyber Financial Crimes Task Force. Online gambling operations outside U.S. jurisdiction are federal matters. The FBI will investigate, but these organizations are slippery. Prosecuting them is like nailing smoke to a wall, so they get away with it. Not entirely. Once your son is under court supervision and his assets frozen for restitution, these entities lose interest. They can't squeeze blood from a stone. They'll write off the debt and move on. There was a pause. But there's something else you need to know, and this is why I'm calling today. We've been conducting surveillance on your residence, and we've identified 2 vehicles making multiple passes by your building over the past week. I felt cold adrenaline. What kind of vehicles? Both registered to shell companies with non-existent addresses. 1 black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows. 1 dark gray Dodge Charger. We've flagged them as likely connected to the offshore loan operations. They're looking for leverage, trying to determine if you have assets they can pressure you or your son into liquidating. What do you recommend? First, don't open your door to anyone you don't personally know. Second, if anyone approaches you anywhere, don't engage. Walk inside, lock doors, call 911. We've increased patrols and flagged your address for priority response. Units will arrive in under 3 minutes. Understood. I've survived 40 years in aerospace, detective. I know how to handle containment breaches. I'm sure you do, but these aren't engineers. They operate outside the system and respond to fear and profit. Please be careful. I promise. Thank you for the warning. There was a pause. Mr. Garrison, what you did, documenting everything, building your survival plan, exposing your son's betrayal, that took extraordinary courage. Many victims wouldn't have fought back. You chose to protect yourself. That's not something to feel guilty about. I felt tightness in my chest. Thank you, Detective. That means more than you know. We'll be in touch after the 27th. Try to have as peaceful a holiday as you can. You've earned it. I hung up and stood in the quiet kitchen listening to my valve tick. I walked to the window, half expecting a black SUV at the curb. Nothing. Just empty pavement and Christmas lights from neighboring apartments. I wasn't going to hide. I reached for my coat and stepped into the December cold, feeling Detective Martinez's words settle over me like armor. Survivors don't hide. They adapt, fortify, and keep moving forward. The marble floors of Denver County Courthouse echoed with my footsteps as I walked through the oak doors on April 18th, 2025. The air smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the metallic tang of anxiety clinging to the walls. I adjusted my charcoal suit and made my way to courtroom 4B, my attorney Christopher Ward beside me carrying his briefcase. It's essentially a formality, Thane Christopher said quietly. Your son agreed to plead guilty 3 weeks ago. The judge will make it official, hear impact statements, and hand down sentence. The DA and I worked out the plea terms already. I nodded, but felt hollow like a spacecraft that had jettisoned too much mass and was drifting through void. My son was about to be sentenced for trying to let me die to pay gambling debts, and all I could think about was the 8-year-old who sat on my lap reading books about rockets. We entered the courtroom. The space was smaller than expected, paneled in dark wood with pew-like benches. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows. I sat at the plaintiff's table. Christopher set his briefcase down with a thud that echoed. Across the aisle sat Merritt, hunched forward in a cheap, borrowed suit. His public defender, a tired-looking young man with crooked tie, flipped through notes. Merritt didn't look at me. He stared at the table, hands clasped white-knuckled. I felt nothing. No rage, no sadness, just the steady tick of my valve counting seconds. The bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Beverly Sinclair presiding. We stood as Judge Sinclair entered, black robe flowing. She was late 50s, silver hair and severe bun, reading glasses perched on nose. Her expression was stern, someone who'd seen every human failure and was no longer surprised. "Be seated," she commanded, taking her place. She adjusted glasses and scanned the case file with practiced efficiency. The room fell silent, except the HVAC hum and my valve's relentless tick. Judge Sinclair looked up. "We are here for sentencing of Merritt Allen Garrison, who has pled guilty to 2 felony counts, grand larceny under Colorado revised statutes, Section 18-4-401, and financial exploitation of an at-risk adult under Section 18-6.5-103. Mr. Ward, I understand the plaintiff wishes to present a victim impact statement." Christopher stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Thane Garrison has prepared a statement." Judge Sinclair nodded. "Mr. Garrison, please come forward." I walked to the podium carrying a single yellowed paper, a relic from when I believed my son would grow into someone I could be proud of. I set it down and looked at the judge, then briefly at Merritt, who finally raised his eyes to mine. "Your Honor," I began, voice calm and measured. "My name is Thane Garrison. I'm 69, a retired aerospace engineer and father of that man. I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here for accountability." I held up the paper so the courtroom could see faded pencil marks and child's handwriting. "This is an essay my son wrote at age 8, a school assignment called My Hero. Merritt chose me. I read aloud. My dad is a rocket scientist. He helps astronauts go to space to explore other planets. One day, I want to be just like him. He's the smartest and bravest person I know. He says, if you work hard and do the right thing, you can achieve anything. My dad is my hero because he never gives up even when things are hard. I paused, letting words hang like smoke. Then I lowered the paper and looked at Merritt, whose face crumpled with tears. I don't know when that boy disappeared, but the man at that table is not the son I raised. He didn't just steal $320,000. He didn't just gamble away my chance at surviving heart surgery. He stole something more valuable, my faith in family. He calculated my death as a variable in his financial equation. When I asked for help, he chose silence. I looked at Judge Sinclair. I didn't lose money, Your Honor. Money can be replaced. I lost trust, integrity, and belief that the person I raised for 40 years understood right from wrong. That can't be rebuilt. I folded the essay and returned to my seat. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Sinclair removed her glasses and looked at Merritt with profound disappointment. Mr. Garrison, stand, please. Merritt stood, legs shaking visibly. I have presided here 22 years. I've seen thieves, addicts, fraudsters, abusers of every kind. But what you did ranks among the most morally reprehensible acts I've encountered. She leaned forward. You didn't steal from a stranger or defraud a corporation. You exploited your dying father. You took money entrusted to save his life and gambled it away. You sold his memories, achievements, dignity for a bet's fleeting thrill. You're not just a thief. You're a predator who preyed on the one person who should have trusted you unconditionally. Merritt sobbed silently. This court sentences you to 18 months Colorado State Penitentiary, suspended contingent on successful completion of 10 years supervised probation. You will pay restitution of $418,500 plus 8% annual interest at $3,500 monthly beginning in 30 days. 500 hours community service. 2 years mandatory inpatient gambling treatment. Permanent restraining order prohibiting contact with your father or coming within 100 yards of his residence. She raised the gavel and brought it down with a sharp crack. This court is adjourned. Bailiff, escort Mr. Garrison for processing. Merritt turned. Dad, please, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, the bailiff's hand on his shoulder. Sir, you need to come with me. I sat motionless watching as the boy I raised disappeared through the door into the justice system I'd set into motion. Christopher squeezed my shoulder. You did the right thing. I didn't answer. There was no right thing anymore, only the necessary thing. As I stood and gathered my coat, I stepped into bright April sunshine. The mechanical valve in my chest ticked with steady, perfect rhythm. I was 69. I was alive. I had survived my son's betrayal, a failing heart, and family collapse. And for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Sedona's red rocks don't care about your bank balance or your betrayals. They've watched empires crumble for millions of years, making my son's theft feel like little more than a speck of dust in a desert wind. The sound of packing tape sealing the last box in my Denver apartment had been the final note in a symphony of closure. I had spent my life calculating trajectories for vehicles intended to leave this world, but the most difficult maneuver I ever executed was simply walking away from the life I had built for Michael. I moved to Arizona in the high heat of July, trading the gray, haunted streets of Cherry Creek for a small, efficient house with a panoramic view of Cathedral Rock. The air here is thinner, but for the first time in years, it's actually clean. I established a new routine with the same methodical precision I once used to calibrate lunar modules. My mornings begin with a 5-mile hike through the dry, cedar-scented air, my boots crunching on the red sandstone as the sun begins to bleed over the horizon. I spend my afternoons volunteering at the local science center, teaching children how to build small wooden rockets that don't always fly straight, but always fly with integrity. I monitor my heart rate with a clinical detachment, my hand resting over the scar on my chest, as I listen to the rhythmic, comforting tick of the mechanical valve. Structural integrity isn't just about the metal. It's about what you choose to keep inside the hull. Whir. Zip. The shredder ate the letters. Merritt's voice became confetti. Last Tuesday, I received a thick envelope from my lawyer, containing 3 months' worth of letters from Michael sent from the state penitentiary. I sat at my kitchen table weighing the heavy paper in my hand, sensing the excuses, the desperate pleas, and the hollow apologies written inside. I thought about the childhood essay I had read in court, the boy who looked at me like I was a hero, and then I thought about the man who had checked the billing status of my death. I didn't open them. I didn't need to read his variables to know the equation was already solved. Forgiveness is a variable I haven't solved yet, but silence. Silence I understand perfectly. I walked over to the mechanical shredder in the corner of my office and fed them in one by one. I am not his fuel source anymore. He has to find his own way back to Earth. Sedona is a place of heat and pressure, much like the forge that made my new heart valve. It's where you go to find out what's left when the soft parts burn away. I had one final act of engineering to complete. I had revealed to Arlo months ago that I was using a small portion of my NASA pension to anonymously fund a gambling addiction counseling program at the prison where Michael was being held. It wasn't an act of paternal love, but a technical necessity. I was giving him a tool for survival without ever giving him a cent of my money or a single word of my contact. It was a closed-loop system designed to fix a fault without contaminating the rest of the environment. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged peaks of the red rocks, I stepped out onto my porch. The vibrant burning orange of the desert sunset painted the world in shades of fire and copper. I pulled out my tablet and began recording a final video message for the recipients of the Sarah Hayes Memorial Scholarship. Rockets fail when the seals leak. I said, my voice steady and resonating with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. Families fail when the truth is hidden. Be the engineer who checks the seals. Value the integrity of the structure over the speed of the launch. I touched the scar beneath my shirt, the pink fading proof that I had chosen myself when my own flesh and blood had chosen a bet. I realized that while I was solitary, I was no longer broken. The telemetry of my life had finally stabilized. I watched the last sliver of orange disappear behind the rocks, the mechanical tick in my chest steady and true. Finally understanding that love isn't about carrying someone. It's about making sure they have the integrity to stand on their own. I had structured my entire estate with the help of Arlo and a team of ironclad lawyers. It was my final masterpiece of engineering. If Michael ever relapses into gambling after his release, the restitution interest rate on the scholarship fund triples automatically, creating a permanent, automated financial governor on his behavior. It was a system that governed itself free from the noise of my own emotions. If you're looking for a happy ending, where the father and son hug and forget the past, you've come to the wrong engineer. Some systems are beyond repair. You just build a better one. I sat in the gathering twilight, the rough texture of the red sandstone porch under my palms, listening to the desert wind whistle through the cacti. I had survived, and for now, that is the only data point that matters. I watched the first stars begin to prick through the indigo sky, the same stars I had spent 40 years helping men reach. I wasn't looking at them as a destination anymore, but as a reminder of the vast, clean distance between the man I was and the ghosts I had left behind in the Denver snow. The mechanical valve in my chest continued its perfect, tireless work, a heartbeat of carbon and steel that owed nothing to anyone. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of cedar and old stone, finally at peace with the silence of the desert and the rhythmic, certain ticking of my own heart. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this family story was never only about money, betrayal, or survival. It was about the moment a father finally understood that love without boundaries can become permission for destruction. For years, I believed protecting my son meant staying silent, fixing problems quietly, and carrying the weight alone. That was my greatest mistake. If you take anything from this family story, let it be this: loyalty should never cost you your life, your dignity, or your future. I waited too long to face the truth, and that delay nearly destroyed me. My journey became what some people call dad revenge, but in my heart, it was never about revenge. It was about survival and accountability. Still, I would tell any parent listening, don't follow my path. Speak the truth earlier. Protect yourself sooner. Silence does not heal a broken system. It only hides the damage until it explodes. This family story taught me that character matters more than blood. When someone you love begins treating your life like a transaction, you must step back and rebuild your boundaries. Some people might call what I did dad revenge, but I see it as restoring integrity to a life that was nearly stolen. And through it all, I believe God allowed this trial, so I would finally learn that faith, dignity, and truth must stand above family loyalty when that loyalty becomes toxic. In the end, this wasn't just a family story about betrayal, it became a lesson about courage. Some will call it dad revenge, but to me it was simply choosing life. Thank you for walking with me through the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your perspective. If you were in the position of a father discovering his own son gambled away his heart surgery money, what would you have done? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories. A small note before you go: while this narrative touches on real social themes about family conflict and addiction, certain elements were dramatized to strengthen the storytelling experience. If this type of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.